All right, what is up, my push peeps? Welcome back from a week off. Hopefully you got some time to relax, to rest up, and to get ready for your final 3 weeks of the semester. Yes, I know it's already here, believe it or not. But in the next 3 weeks, we're going to wrap up the Civil War. We're going to talk through Reconstruction, what the country does to rebuild physically, but also politically and socially, in the aftermath of the war and the emancipation of slaves. And then we're going to have our cumulative APUSH first semester final, which will take place in 3 weeks. And it'll be the last thing we do for the semester, which I know I said cumulative will involve, of course, period 5 questions, but also content from periods 1, 2, 3, and 4 as well. So make sure these last 3 weeks you commit yourself to dedicating the time you need to be successful to finish the semester on a strong note, so that as it comes time next year to apply for college, you are in good standing to do what you need to do to take those next steps academically. So today, for week 15's core content video, we're going to be talking through Southern secession as the Deep South secedes, pulls out of the Union, and the early stages of the Civil War. We're going to focus in our live session this week on social change in the Civil War, specifically on the evolution of the war on slavery. And then in your extension activity today, you'll talk about the impact of the war on the economy, the impact of the war on other social groups like women and immigrants. So make sure that you have a good holistic view of what's happening. Make sure you've done your chapter, because it's vital to understanding what's happening this week that you get that chapter read. That's why I only assign that one chapter for you to read for all fixing and break. So make sure you do it and do it well, because that's all I assigned. So with that being said, today we're going to talk through really how and why the South seceded. There's a couple of times I'm going to ask you to pause the video and look at a couple short texts to ensure that we're getting a deeper analysis of what's taking place. But all of this begins and happens because of the election of 1860, which is where I left off right before we went to break. Now, if you remember, in 1860, we have the Republican Party headed by their candidate Abraham Lincoln. And the Republican Party platform is not necessarily anti-slavery in the short term. It's anti-expansion of slavery to the territories, to these lovely non-state entities within the United States here out in the West. Now, the Republican position and Lincoln's personal position is that eventually, if you don't let slavery expand, slavery would be on a path towards no longer existing. But in the short term, they make no claim to desire to interfere with the institution of slavery in any of the southern states where slavery already exists. So that's the Republican Party. The Democrats have split into Northern and Southern Democrats. The Northern Democrats are going to nominate our old friend Stephen Douglas, he of Popular Sovereignty fame. And the Southern Democrats are going to nominate John C. Breckinridge. These two are going to differ Democrat-wise in terms of slavery in the territories. Stephen Douglas is still going to commit to the idea of popular sovereignty, whereas the platform of allowing slavery to expand to all territories with a territorial slave code, which will protect slavery into the territories. And then John Bell, for this weird little coalition union party, puts together some of the Whigs who are pro-government, but also pro-cotton, right? Some of the Southern planter elites, as well as the Know Nothing Party, the anti-immigrant groups from the North, into the Constitutional Union Party that's just trying to kind of piece together some semblance of a coalition to win the presidency. So it becomes quite clear in 1860, this is a very consequential election, as Abraham Lincoln is able to win basically the entirety of the Northern Electoral College vote without receiving a single vote in the South, Electoral College-wise. But because the North has such a greater population, therefore they have more Electoral College votes, therefore he's elected president without any Southern support. So here we see our election map. Lincoln wins 59% of the Electoral College vote, followed by Breckinridge at 72%, and the other two further down below at 13% and 4% for Bell and Douglas. And Lincoln wins the popular vote without receiving a majority of the vote. He receives a plurality of the vote with 40% because of his strong support in the northern areas where there just are more people. So with that, the Republican Party, who of course, as you know, because you were in class last week, was only just formed in 1854 in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, has gotten elected their first presidential candidate, Abraham Lincoln, here in 1860. So with the election of a Republican, the Deep South, the Lower South, down here, South Carolina and across, are going to say we're out, we're gone, we're done. Of course, South Carolina goes first. They hold their Secession Convention in December of 1860. So Lincoln is elected in November of 1860. Lincoln won't take office until early the next year, that lame duck period in between, like we're living in right now. South Carolina has their convention. They come together. They say, we are not living in this country under a Republican president. We've dealt with these abuses long enough. You may remember back to like 1850, John Calhoun saying, let us spread slavery to the entire territories or we're going to leave. So the South has threatened this before. South Carolina specifically has threatened this before, but now they're actually going to do it. South Carolina is going to go first, and they're going to say, we are out. We're gone. We're gone. And I'm going to have you read South Carolina's justification here in just a minute. But in the meantime, the question becomes like, can a state even do that? Does a state have the right to leave the Union when they feel like it, based on whatever justifications, whatever reasons they give? Does a state have the ability to just say, we're gone? I don't know. Let's find out. So the president at the time is James Buchanan, who we talked about last week, right? James Buchanan, incredibly timid, ineffective president. He is surrounded by very, very pro-slavery advisors, pro-South advisors. So Buchanan's response is quite funny. He says, constitutionally speaking, right, according to the Constitution, you do not have the right to leave the Union. South Carolina, you can't leave. South Carolina says, well, we're leaving anyway. And Buchanan basically says with his actions, I'm not going to stop you. I'm not going to do anything about it, but you can't leave. You can't do that. He's a lame duck president, right? He's already half checked out. He knows he's not the next president. He's surrounded by pro-slave advisors, so he's incredibly ineffectual in solving this problem. His argument is quite simply that words should be able to stop South Carolina from leaving. And if words aren't enough, I'm not willing to do anything else extra. There's one last gasp attempt at compromise to try to piece things back together. A congressman last name Crittenden proposes the Crittenden Compromise, and all it ends up proposing is backed like the Missouri Compromise line of 3630. Put that line across the continent, that line across the country. South of that line, slavery should be able to expand to the territories. North of that line, it could expand based on popular sovereignty. So really, this compromise is very, very pro-South because the South's the one that's leaving. And Lincoln says, absolutely not. Lincoln says, no. Now, if you create this compromise in Congress, I refuse to sign it as the new president because I was elected president on the platform of no longer allowing slavery to spread to the territories. That's why I was elected. That's what I stand for. That's what I was elected on. Accepting this compromise would be to go back on what the people have just stated in the election, that they want a president who refuses to allow slavery to expand. So the Crittenden Compromise is supposed to appease the South, because they'd be able to spread slavery again. And Lincoln says no, because it's not what he was elected to do. So in this case, he backs public opinion, backs what the public has stated in their election of him, and rejects this idea out of hand. So this group in the South, the Deep South, they're going to be called the Fire Eaters, are the most aggressive pro-secession, pro-expansion of slavery Southerners, are going to demand withdrawal of the Southern states immediately after the election. Lincoln's not even president yet. He's just elected president, and they're already leaving. Now, Buchanan, he tells Congress, like, no state has the right to secede from the Union, right? This is not a legal thing the Southern states are doing. But also suggests that the federal government has no authority to stop a state if it did, which is a weird way to talk out of both sides of your mouth and try to argue that both groups should just kind of let the South go. So what's going to happen in the Deep South, beginning in this lame duck period, is the states are going to secede, and they're going to start taking over the federal property within their boundaries. And then the federal government owns, right? Forts, supplies, all weapons depots, armories, right? All these things. The Southern states like South Carolina, and then following them, Georgia, Texas, Alabama, Louisiana, the whole Deep South are going to secede, which, as Buchanan says, is not allowed, but he's not going to stop them. And then as they secede, they're going to take over all the Southern properties, the forts, the weapons, the resources, et cetera, within their state, which they're going to then use really to conduct their war effort. By February of 1861, 6 other states have joined South Carolina. Again, Lincoln's not president yet. Florida's out, Georgia's out, Mississippi's out, Alabama's out, Louisiana's out, Texas is out. And they're going to seize all the federal property within their boundaries, right? The forts, the arsenals, the government offices, the post offices, et cetera. And they're going to act as if they are an actual country. They're going to elect Jefferson Davis as their first president, first and only president. Spoiler alert, they're going to lose the war. And they're going to form what becomes known as the Confederate States of America. So we're going to refer to them throughout the week as the Confederacy. This is because they've formed the Confederate States of America. They're going to create their capital in Montgomery, Alabama. Later, once Virginia joins them, they'll move the capital up further north to Richmond, Virginia, which is where it stays until the end of the war. And then the following month, Lincoln takes office. Now what? Right, imagine taking office as the new president and having 7 states of your country having already said, we're not living in this country under your presidency. Unprecedented and never before seen since example of presidential chaos that he has to see what he does with it throughout this week. So go ahead and pause the video real quick and take a look at this phenomenal political cartoon, which is going to point out some of the ridiculousness, if you will, of the secession movement. So go ahead and hit pause and take a look. Answer for me on your handout. What is this cartoon's point of view regarding secession in 1860, 1861? What is this cartoon arguing about what the South is doing? If you look closely, you see South Carolina there at first, right? They're on a pig, living it up. And South Carolina says, if you can't quite see it, we go the whole hog, as he's riding a hog, right? To go whole hog means kind of to go all in. We go the whole hog. Old Hickory is dead, and now we'll have it. Old Hickory. You all, being the APUSH scholars that you are, know that's a little reference to our old friend Andrew Jackson, who was the president the last time South Carolina tried to pull some stuff like this, and he stopped them, if you remember. But now Old Hickory's dead, now we'll have it, as he chases the secession bug here. Right, behind him, Florida. Go it, Carolina. We are the boys to wreck the Union. Alabama, behind them, says, we go it blind. We don't know what's happening. We're going to go into this blind, but cotton is king. We'll do anything for cotton. Mississippi, behind them, says, down with the Union. Mississippi repudiates her bonds. Louisiana in the back. Go it, boys. We'll soon taste the sweets of secession. Right, and then here's Florida. Excuse me, this is Georgia down on the side, Georgia. And it says, we have some doubts about the end of that road, and we think it's best to deviate a little. All right, so go ahead and take a second. What is this cartoon arguing about the secession movement? All right, pick up on the clues in the words, the fact that they're going off a cliff. Go ahead and take a second to respond to that, and then we'll dive into what is next. Okay, so this is what we're looking at. Right, in terms of when they secede and what order they secede. South Carolina is first, followed by Mississippi, and second. Florida is third, followed by Alabama, followed by Georgia, followed by Louisiana, followed finally by Texas. And then Lincoln is sworn in. Lincoln takes office in March of 2020, looking at all these blue states having already seceded, having already left the Union. So why? How do they justify this constitutionally speaking? And so the Southern decision to secede was based on arguments that you guys are already familiar with from class, right? Their argument's going to be back to that compact versus contract theory we talked about as early as the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions under the Adams presidency because of the Alien and Sedition Acts. Their argument, constitutionally speaking, is going to be that the U.S. is a compact, an agreement of states that have come together as independent states. Right? Not that the U.S. has a national government that's above the states. They're going to argue that the United States is just states, right? And each state entered into the Union independently, and thus each state could leave that agreement independently when a state decided to do so. Therefore, states could leave the Union freely and peacefully based on the fact that if a state opted into this agreement, a state could then also opt out of this agreement. And because of state sovereignty, state power, states' rights, in this case slavery, must be protected as a guarantee of liberty, as a limit on the federal government's power. Now, this is not, of course, the first time the South has threatened to secede or tried to secede. The South threatened to secede during the original debate about slavery in 1790, which gave us a 3/5 compromise on the protection of slavery in the Constitution. There were threats to secede over the issue of Missouri with the Missouri Compromise in 1820. We just talked about the nullification crisis in South Carolina in 1832 as South Carolina tried to nullify a federal tariff. And there were also threats to secede, specifically by South Carolina and John C. Calhoun over California in 1850. So not the first time the South has threatened this, although this is the first time it actually gets followed through on. Right. And the foundation of this is that individuals have the right to own property. In this case, the property is slaves. And they thus have the right to have their property returned with the fugitive slave law. So their argument is going to be actually that the northern states are who violated the agreements that everyone have come into by refusing to return their slaves, by refusing to allow property to expand anywhere, et cetera. So therefore, the South had no choice but to leave the Union to protect their rights to property, in this case, slaves. So take a second. This is really, really important for our week. So make sure you actually freaking do it. I'll be watching. Take a second and read I just excerpted these for you. South Carolina's order of secession, in which they justify why they're leaving, as well as Georgia's order of secession, in which they tell us why they're leaving. And tell me in that right-hand column, what are the arguments that both give? What are give me a bulleted list is just fine. But I need a list of the reasons they give that justify their secession. Read it, take 5, take 7, take 9, take the time you need, but take this time right now, dive into the text, and then tell me in the column how they justify their secession. That's how we'll start our live lesson, so make sure you have that done and ready to go. Now, eventually, the Confederate States of the U.S. are going to look like this, and all this light tan. Looks like my skin tone. I've been inside a lot these days. It's cold, it's winter. But this light tan is going to be what makes up the Confederate States of America. They're formed officially. They come together on February 4th of 1861, and they're going to put together their own constitution. All right, it's going to be based on the U.S. Constitution, very, very, very similar to the U.S. Constitution, with a couple of key differences. And these key differences are very telling. So make sure you know exactly what these differences are and what that says about what the Confederacy really believes in. Now, the Constitution is going to be built just like the U.S. Constitution, structurally speaking, with 4 key changes. 4 key changes. Change 1, state sovereignty, right? Meaning there's no supremacy clause, no statement that says that the national government has supremacy over the states, which is what the U.S. Constitution has. All right, so protect states' rights. 2, it guarantees slavery in any territory the Confederate States have or will have in the future. So it explicitly protects the institution of slavery. 3, it references God in a way the U.S. Constitution does not. And 4, it prohibits tariffs, because again, we know the South is not in favor of tariffs. So that is the system in which their constitution will be formed. Their society will be built on this foundation. And of course, they elect Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis as their first and only president. And that is how we enter into this civil war, in which the southern states are fighting their war to become independent, to have their own nation with these key characteristics. And the northern states, the Union is fighting to ensure that the southern states don't get to just leave. Now, you might be asking, why? Why does the U.S. even care if the southern states come, go, stay, whatever? What's the big deal? 1, cotton, very valuable to the entire economy. But 2, precedent. Right? If we let states just come and go as they please, we don't have a country at all. Right? If today California could be like, yeah, we're out. Bye. Right? That's not a country at all. It's a loose agreement of a bunch of states in a way that is not a stable way to form a nation going forward. So thus the Civil War takes place. Now the war is going to actually begin a month plus into Lincoln's presidency. He takes office in March. He says in his inaugural address, we'll read it in our live session, but he says hey, we don't want war, right? If war comes, it'll be the South that starts it, because we're not the ones trying to leave. We're just here running the country. You guys don't get to leave. We're not going to start the war, but if you want to be the aggressors, then we'll fight a war. And thus, Lincoln actually is going to force the South to be the aggressors and start the war in a pretty meaningful way. That's going to take place at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Now, as I've told you, the southern states, as they secede, they're going to seize all the federal property in their state. Fort Sumter is one example of federal property that the South could not seize because it is a fort off the coast of South Carolina that's held by the U.S. Army, the U.S. military. So it is still in Union hands. The American government still has control of this Fort Sumter, right off the coast of South Carolina. All right. Now, South Carolina and the Confederacy has demanded, hey, give us that fort. It's in our territory. We've left the country. It's ours now. Right. And U.S. soldiers have said, no, this is U.S. federal property. You can't just have this fort. We're holding on to this. If you want it, you can come take it. Standoff. All right. These federal soldiers have refused Confederate demands to vacate the fort, to give up the fort, but they're running low on supplies. So Lincoln says explicitly, hey, I'm not committing an act of war. I'm just sending supplies to our guys that are at that fort. They're running low on food, running low on water. They need supplies. They need resources. We're not starting a war here. We're just resupplying a fort that is ours, anyway. South Carolina and the Confederacy refuses to allow that. He sends aid to the soldiers. Confederates open fire on the fort. They shell the fort. They attack the fort from the South Carolina coast. And with that, the war begins with a Confederate victory as the Union then gives up this fort and says, cool, you want the fort? No biggie, but let it be known that you're the ones that started this war, not us. The firing on Fort Sumter proves to be the beginning of the Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in the United States history by far. Once it becomes clear that this is actually going to be a real war, not just a little bit of a short-term temporary conflict, the upper South states, those big slave states that had not yet seceded, are going to secede as well and join the Confederacy. And not all slave states secede. There's a couple that we'll talk about here in a minute. And those slave states that stay in the Union are going to be called border states for us going forward. But it is Fort Sumter that is the spark that begins the Civil War. Now, there are 4 states that have slaves that actually don't leave the Union. Delaware has like 12 slaves at this point. They're right there, the tiny little state east of Washington, D.C. They're not worth knowing a whole hell of a lot about. So they stay in the Union. But the 2 really, really big ones are Maryland and Kentucky. Now, Maryland, if you remember, Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, is right on the border between Maryland on one side and Virginia on the other. Now, Virginia secedes. Virginia and North Carolina are going to secede after Fort Sumter, not before, but they're out. They're gone. So if Maryland also was able to secede, that would put the nation's capital in the middle of another country, right? In the middle of the Confederate States of America. So Maryland has some strong Confederate sympathies, some strong pro-Southern loyalties. But when they vote yes or no on secession, they vote to stay in the Union, right? They vote not by a lot, but they vote to stay in the Union. And because they surround Washington, D.C., Maryland is vitally important to keep in the Union. With this close margin, once Lincoln takes office, he declares martial law, which is military law, basically getting rid of their state government for a short time and having the U.S. Army run the state to ensure they don't secede. And Lincoln also suspends habeas corpus. And that's an important element of our judicial system, which basically just means when you are arrested, you have the right to know what you're being arrested for, to being presented with a list of your charges and the evidence against you so that you can defend yourself in court. He's going to suspend this so that the U.S. military and government can arrest people who are trying to get Maryland to secede as committing treason and put them in jail. This is going to lead to a little bit of controversy over the constitutionality of this action. Lincoln's going to justify it by saying, well, they're trying to leave the country. That's treason, and thus I need to do whatever I can to keep the country together. The U.S. military is going to actually arrest 1/3 of Maryland's state government for trying to get the state to secede. And they're going to actually use martial law, the military, to keep Maryland in the Union throughout the entire war. Kentucky tries to claim that they're neutral. They say, we're not taking a side in this war, not one way or the other. But Lincoln says very clearly early in the war, he says, I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. Like, it'd be nice to have God, but Kentucky's more important. What he means by this is because Kentucky is right there on the Ohio River, and there's very, very valuable land in between North and South, Lincoln makes it very, very clear early on that he doesn't think the Union can win the war without keeping Kentucky in, and thus they do. Missouri as well, as you know, Missouri is a slave state because of the Missouri Compromise. But Missouri's state legislature, their state government, votes pretty strongly in favor of staying in the Union. Their governor doesn't like that. He's pro-Confederate. Claiborne Jackson, he tries to call out the state militia to fight for the Confederacy. So Missouri is going to kind of have their own little civil war for much of the war between Union and Confederacy, but they're not going to be nearly as pivotal in the war as Kentucky and Maryland. Interestingly enough, this is when we see a brand new state formed called West Virginia. The whole state of Virginia secedes. They leave. 1 year into the war, the yeomanry, the small everyday farmer class that's largely in the northwestern part of Virginia, right up here, is going to secede from the Confederacy and opt back into the Union and recognized as a state in 1862. And thus that becomes, these red states are areas in which slavery is present and legal, but do not join the Confederacy during the war. So that's kind of how we set the stage. Looking at advantages and disadvantages of this war is important. The Union has a huge population advantage, right? 18.5 people versus the Confederacy has 5.5 million free and 3.5 million slave population, right? So even if they were to add the two up as if the slaves would be willing to fight for the Confederacy, which is hilarious and false, we'd be looking at 9 million versus 18 million. So the Union has a huge population advantage, also a huge economic advantage, right? In terms of $234 million worth of economic stability here in the Union versus only 74 million in the Confederacy. As you know, we talked about this at the beginning of period 5, the way the South's social structure is built is that the wealth is consolidated at the top, and they're still living in a sense in this mercantile system of providing raw materials elsewhere, in this case, cotton. The Union grows more important things that are good for a war effort: corn, wheat, and horses and livestock, so that you can actually feed your troops. But the Confederacy has a big advantage in cotton, which is good. It's only a good advantage in war if you're having a pillow fight. A big advantage in cotton, big advantage in rice, and big advantage in tobacco. Maybe they can smoke out the Union. Industrially speaking, the Union has 101,000 factories with over 1 million factory workers, whereas the South only has 20% of that number in factories and 10% of the factory workers. The Union has double the railroad, almost 100% of the firearm production, and they have an existing army, which the Confederacy doesn't have because they're not a country yet. The U.S. has the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy, which the Confederacy does not have. Eventually, the Confederacy will enlist about 1.2 million men, so less than half of what the Union will enlist. But their big advantages are the hopes that they're fighting a defensive war. The philosophy here is that much like the colonists against the British, the Confederacy doesn't have to win the war. They just have to fight the war long enough for the Union to give up and go away, right? They're fighting a more defensive war, and they're fighting for a more clear cause, right? Their why is very clear: independence, protection of slavery, right? The Union why is a little more murky, right? They're fighting to keep somebody who wants to leave from leaving. It's a little bit less of a clear why in terms of fighting a war effort. But the big thing the Confederacy is leaning on is the hope of cotton diplomacy, meaning they think their cotton is so valuable to other countries, specifically England and France, that England and France will intervene on their account to support them in hopes of keeping their cotton market available, right? So it looks like, if you're more of a visual learner like I am, right? From a population standpoint, the blue is the north, the gray is the south. As you see, big population advantage. big bank deposit advantage, huge factory advantage. But check us out, right? The South's got 99.9% of the cotton. Good for them. Again, in a pillow fight, they're stocked up and ready to go. Food crops, North. Horses, North. Ooh, the South does in fact have more donkeys and mules, so that's good. They can ride their mule into war, swinging their pillows of cotton. Be good to go. And railroad tracks, huge advantage for the North as well. So those are kind of the things to look at, the main advantages that the North contains and holds. The Union has way bigger population for troops, way greater industrial capacity, and a huge edge in infrastructure, in transportation, in railroads specifically. And we see kind of another visualization of the data right there as well. But there are some challenges to overcome. One, the North has to invade the South to win. The North has to go into the South and force them to give up this effort in order to win the war, much like the British with the colonists. Two, it would be very difficult for the northern states to maintain enthusiasm and support for the war over a long period of time. Right? At a certain point, when does the public ask, like, why don't we just let those people have their war and leave? Right? Why is it worth it to keep fighting this war? Right. So the Confederacy, of course, outnumbered, of course, less industrial, they still have their clear advantages, right? Advantage one, they don't have to win the war. They just have to play defense long enough for the Union to go away. Drag out the war long enough to make the northern states quit. And the other advantage, which we've already talked about, is King Cotton diplomacy. This belief that using cotton as a carrot will entice England and France to support the South. Now, if you look at British cotton consumption, you see that England's factory system has gone from consuming very little cotton to consuming 8 million tons of cotton a year by 1900. 1860, of course, when the Civil War begins, so it's up to already 5 million tons a year. And this is the only decade in this entire time period where cotton actually decreases. Let that be a little bit of a little preview for what happens with the war. So the Confederacy is going to use cotton diplomacy to try to get England and France to help them. Napoleon III is in charge of France this time. He favors the South. He prefers the South's aristocratic type of social system, but he doesn't want to jump in and help the South without England doing so first. So he kind of just doesn't. England chooses a more of a hands-off policy, saying this is y'all's conflict. We don't want to get involved in it, right? And the South's relying so much on this being their way to win the war actually is going to backfire badly, because by 1863, so 2 years into the war, England has turned to Egypt and India to get their cotton, filling their demand for cotton, and thus no longer even needing the South's cotton either during the war, and then even after the war. The South's gonna be like, all right, cool, we can at least sell our cotton, and England's like, we got our cotton elsewhere. So this is gonna backfire in a couple ways. But if you think about revolutions over time in history, most successful revolutions against the country that currently runs you or rules you or controls you, most successful revolutions have been successful because of foreign intervention. Right? The US Revolution is successful because of France's help. In this case, one of the main reasons the Confederacy fails is because of a lack of foreign intervention. So the last couple of things to talk about are the draft and slavery. Both sides are going to begin the war with an all-volunteer army, but within a very short period of time, it becomes clear that that's not going to do it. The war is not going to be done quickly like they both hope. So eventually, drafts, also called conscription, are going to be installed, in which people are chosen at random to come enter the war effort. In the northern states, you could pay someone to take your spot, or pay a fee to the government to not draft you, or you can be exempted for medical reasons. So if you could hire somebody maybe who isn't a citizen. So a lot of these new immigrants coming from England, from Ireland and Germany, mostly Irish, are going to be hired as replacements from people who are drafted. In the South, the planter elite, the ones who really caused the Civil War, those who own a large number of slaves, are exempt from the draft. which gives the Civil War this title, this philosophy really of being a rich man's war, as it's a war that's benefiting the rich, right, to protect slavery or to protect cotton in the U.S., but a poor man's fight, as we're asking most of Americans poor to actually fight the war. There's wide opposition to the draft, especially in the North. In the northern states specifically, there are large-scale draft riots, large-scale riots that are against the draft that are only going to increase after the Emancipation Proclamation goes into place. We'll talk about that in our live session. But once the war becomes in the North more than just about Union, but about abolishing slavery as well, you're going to see wide opposition in northern cities, especially New York, that are opposed to being drafted to fight in a war to end slavery because they themselves have no desire to fight for that cause. Most opposition to the draft is going to come from the laboring class, from immigrants, and from Democrats who don't believe in that philosophical change in why the war is being fought to center on slavery. All right, as you can see, volunteers wanted. The government's going to pay people to fight in the war. They're going to have bounties to try to entice volunteers to join them. And that doesn't work, then the draft will be used. Now, early on, actually, the North is quite unsuccessful in their attempt to end the war quickly. By 1862, so 2 years into the war, the North has achieved total naval supremacy. They're going to use a naval blockade to keep the South from getting resources in or out from foreign help. They're going to clear all Confederate troops, from West Virginia, from Kentucky, from a lot of Tennessee. They're going to capture the really important port of New Orleans down in Louisiana. So that's important to the North by early 1862. But things look better for the South. The first big battle outside Washington, D.C., the first battle of Bull Run, is won by the Confederacy. The Confederates are going to win a pretty important battle in Mississippi at Shiloh, and they're going to defend their capital, Richmond, from capture when it looks early on like the Union could have seized the Confederate capital and ended the war quite quickly. The Confederate Army will successfully defend Richmond. So 2 years into the war, both sides expected a quick, 2-3 month war. We're 2 years in, we're tens of thousands of dead soldiers in, and it really looks like a stalemate at this point, like a tie. And as you know, a stalemate benefits the South because they don't have to win. They just have to fight the war long enough to not lose. Now, the idea of ending slavery is quite difficult for Lincoln and the Republicans for a couple reasons, right? We'll talk about slavery a lot in the live session. This is just kind of to preface it for you. Reason one, right? Lincoln needs to keep those border states that are slave states in the country, like Kentucky, like Maryland, right? This idea that if Republicans act on slavery, then the slave states that still have the border states that have some slaves are going to leave and join the Confederacy is really worrisome for the war effort. That's reason one. Reason two, slavery is technically constitutional, right? It's protected in the Constitution, and the only way to change the Constitution is by an amendment. And Lincoln and the Republicans in Congress can't do that by themselves. They need 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states, et cetera. So because slavery is constitutional, what really can be done about it without changing the Constitution? Challenge. Third, racism. Right? Racism in the North and among Democrats elsewhere and Republicans too. Right? There's this feeling like, yeah, we want to free the slaves, but we don't want them to come here and compete with us for jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And the fourth reason is Lincoln needs to get reelected in 1864. And if he makes slavery more central to the war, then what does that do to his reelection chances and thus the war effort? However, there are some pretty clear actions early on by Republicans that demonstrate a path forward towards emancipation that's really important for you to center on before we talk about our live session this week. And those are called the Confiscation Acts. Early on in the war, the Republican-controlled Congress is going to approve of two acts, the Confiscation Acts of 1861 and 1862. And what that's going to say, these acts, what they're going to do is they're going to identify that captured slaves, if a slave, for whatever reason, makes it to the Union Army, the Union Army has no obligation to return that slave to the Confederate owners. Now, this might sound logical to you, sure, but it's a question of property and warfare and this and that. The justification here is that because these slaves could be used to support the Confederate war effort, the Union Army has the constitutional ability to take away slaves so that they can't help the South. Now, as word spreads of these confiscation acts, what we start seeing is slaves freeing themselves. Right? Anywhere the Union Army goes, local slaves are going to flee, come to the Union Army, and thus know they'll be protected because of these confiscation acts. So really the process of emancipation begins by slaves themselves fleeing to the Union Army, and the Union Army being able to keep the slaves because of these confiscation acts of 1861 and 1862. So the Union and Lincoln don't move specifically to abolish slavery, but are doing some pretty important actions early on that are going to weaken the institution of slavery before chopping it down in our live session. So the war, of course, is lasting much longer than any side expected. By 1863, we see a new Enrollment Act in which people can pay $300 for a substitute, $5,400 in today's money. But again, by 1863, as you read about, the Emancipation Proclamation has been issued. The war is more about slavery than it was previously. Leads to the most famous that you need to know, draft resistance and the New York City draft riots. As we see here, they're hanging a black man in effigy. It's not actually someone being hung, but just a depiction of somebody to show that these angry mobs in New York, specifically Boston as well as elsewhere, are not into the idea of fighting a war to end slavery. And there it is, the New York City draft / emancipation riot. Just, again, showing how challenging it is to fight the war and also deal with slavery when public opinion is in favor of the war, but maybe not so in favor of abolishing slavery, et cetera. And that's because of the political differences that are at play here, right? Lincoln's being pulled in a lot of different directions. And we'll talk about some of this in our live session. The radical Republicans, more extreme Republicans, are of the belief that Lincoln's being too soft on the Confederacy, that abolitionism should be the key focus, Black equality should be a major goal of the war, and we need to be acting more aggressively, more radically to make social change a focus of the war. The more conservative Republicans are in favor of not letting slavery expand, but they don't support Lincoln's evolution throughout the war to make slavery a real cause, a real focus of the war. On the other side of the aisle, we have the Democrats. The war Democrats are not in favor of abolishing slavery, but they are in favor of fighting the war against the Confederacy to make sure that secession never happens again. Chief amongst them is Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, a Democrat from Tennessee, one of the few Southern politicians who does not actually leave the Union. And on the other side, the very far other side, are the Copperheads or the Peace Democrats, right? Much more Jackson-style, Jacksonian Democrats, who would prefer an immediate peace settlement with the Confederacy, let them go, whatever, we don't want to fight the war. They're concentrated in the Ohio River Valley, so Ohio, Illinois, et cetera, and urban areas like New York City. You saw the draft riots there. And the best example of this is a congressman from Ohio named Clement Vallandigham, who actually is going to be deported from the U.S. to the Confederacy by Lincoln for trying to stir up too much trouble to hurt the war effort. And that's going to be on that side of things. So we'll end here with this great map, which shows slow progress at the beginning of the war. As we see, 1861 and 1862 are these two lightish colors. Right, 2 years into the war, the Union has just controlled parts of West Virginia, parts of Kentucky, parts of Tennessee. But this vast majority of the South is still controlled by the Confederacy, as well as the western parts of the Deep South as well, with the Union making some inroads down the Mississippi River Valley. So that's what things look like. That's where we'll pick things up as we look at the evolution of war aims in our live session. Thank you for listening. I can't wait to see you, and let's finish this semester strong. Thanks, y'all.